Welcome to This Explainer. If you found your way to this specific topic today, I think it's highly likely that you, or maybe someone you care very deeply about, is currently navigating a really profound and honestly an entirely misunderstood terrain of pain. What we're talking about here is an existential crisis. It is a total, ground-up collapse of the meaning structures that used to hold your entire world together. And right off the bat, I just want to acknowledge with incredibly deep empathy the massive weight of what you might be carrying right now. It can feel like this absolute profound disconnection. It's a state where literally all the color just drains from the world, and it leaves behind this massive void that no amount of material comfort, no amount of success or achievement can possibly fill. But what if the entire framework we're using to view this suffering is actually completely backwards? It's a seriously provocative question, isn't it? What if your depression isn't a sickness at all, but awakening? Now look, in our highly medicalized society, we are deeply conditioned to view intense emotional suffering as a pathology. We think of it as a broken brain, right? A misfiring of neurochemistry, a malfunction that just needs to be fixed as quickly as possible so we can get back to being normal. But what if this specific type of suffering isn't a disease? What if it's an ontological crisis? It's an evolutionary impulse, a literal mutation of your consciousness. It is the agonizing, yet completely necessary process of the human soul encountering the fundamental questions of what it even means to exist. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the process of dissolution. There's this brilliant observation by the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron, where she says, "Only to the extent that we expose ourselves over and over to annihilation can that which is indestructible be found in us." This crisis you're in, it's initiated precisely because your former certainties and the identities you constructed for yourself are being completely annihilated. You start to see through the constructed nature of social values. You see the impermanence of literally everything around you, and you sense this fundamental emptiness at the heart of all forms. And let's be honest, it is absolutely devastating. It triggers exactly what the philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff called the terror of the situation. It's that jarring realization that what you've always experienced as I or me doesn't actually have a solid foundation. So let's really dive into this and see how the dark night actually begins, and what it means to deconstruct this overwhelming void. The absolute foundation of this entire experience is a concept called ontological emptiness. Now, conventional depression often centers around feelings of personal inadequacy, or maybe grief over a very specific situational loss, like a breakup or losing a job. But this is fundamentally different. This is a baseline sense that existence itself lacks meaning. It pertains to the very nature of being alive. The philosopher Martin Heidegger actually called this existential homesickness. And I just love that term because it perfectly describes this profound, almost cellular yearning to return to a primordial state of unity and belonging, a state that completely transcends the heavy limitations of our physical existence. You are quite literally standing before what existential philosophers call the abyss. What's really fascinating is how these specific symptoms essentially map out the void. They show a systemic, total disconnection from consensus reality. First off, there is a complete disillusionment with material pursuits. Consumer culture doesn't just feel kind of unsatisfying anymore, it actually feels toxic to the soul. It induces what Jean-Paul Sartre termed the vertigo of possibility. Then, as the boundaries between yourself and others start to dissolve, you develop this heightened, almost unbearable sensitivity to suffering. You literally begin to experience the collective pain of humanity or the environment as your own personal pain. Then there's temporal disorientation. The future looks completely empty. The past feels like a massive illusion, and the present moment is just unbearably intense. You also get hit with cosmic loneliness. That's a term from Martin Buber, and it describes feeling separated not just from your friends or family, but isolated from the universe itself. And finally, there is this agonizing yearning for authenticity. You recognize this massive, gaping canyon between your current day-to-day reality and your deep inner truth. Okay, so how do we actually tell these two apart? Let's establish the core contrast between psychological and spiritual depression. When we look at psychological depression, it is fundamentally biographical. It arises from identifiable external factors in your life: job loss, trauma, relationship difficulties. It follows a very clear narrative. I was doing okay, I was functioning fine, until X occurred. It is a disruption in your personal life story. But spiritual depression, that has evolutionary origins. It arises not because something went wrong in your daily circumstances, but because consciousness itself is actively attempting to transcend its current limitations. It is an evolutionary push. It's an initiation that deeply follows the universal, ancient pattern of the hero's journey. Digging a little deeper into the actual underpinnings here, psychological depression is deeply, deeply tied to neurobiological factors. We're talking about neurotransmitter imbalances, things like serotonin and dopamine, or systemic inflammation. It operates entirely within the material, physical dimension. Spiritual depression, however, penetrates all the way down to the metaphysical level. The individual is confronting what Carl Jaspers called boundary situations. These are those terrifying, awe-inspiring moments where ordinary, everyday explanations totally fail, and you encounter the raw mysteries of existence directly. It asks fundamental questions about reality, about consciousness, and about being itself. And honestly, those are questions that simply cannot be answered by just adjusting your brain chemistry. And here is perhaps the most fascinating, paradoxical difference of them all. Psychological depression typically manifests as a severe constriction of awareness. Your perception, your engagement with the world, your sense of what's possible, it all shrinks violently inward. Spiritual depression, on the flip side, is actually characterized by an expansive awareness. Your ego is literally being overwhelmed by a heightened, massive expansion of perception. You suddenly have access to these previously unconscious dimensions of human experience. As the mystic Teresa of Avila famously noted, the pain in this state arises not from darkness, but from too much light. You are suffering because your awareness has completely outgrown the existing structures of your identity. It's like trying to run next-generation software on a 10-year-old computer. The system just overloads. This brings us to a really critical juncture. What happens when the old maps fail? Let's talk about the false antidotes we're often handed. The crucial point we have to face is that traditional therapy often aims to adjust you back into a cultural trance, instead of actually honoring the massive transformation you're going through. Standard therapy frequently reduces these profound, transcendent states to mere regression or dissociation. It focuses heavily on helping you adapt back to consensus reality and societal norms. But, as a psychiatrist R.D. Laing so brilliantly pointed out, the perfectly adjusted person in our society may be the person who is most deeply disturbed. Furthermore, traditional therapy relies on these linear models of progress. It tries to get you back to how you were, while reinforcing separate, atomistic ego boundaries. And the irony is, those are the exact boundaries a spiritual awakening is desperately trying to dissolve. Now, this naturally brings us to a highly sensitive, but absolutely vital warning from the literature. While psychiatric medications are absolutely revolutionary, and yes, they are vital for strictly psychological suffering, applying them blindly to spiritual depression carries some really profound risks. Misdiagnosing a mutation of consciousness as a simple pathology can inflict what's known as iatrogenic harm. That means the medical treatment itself actually causes damage. Medications can suppress these spiritual emergencies. They can mute our emotional responsiveness and literally dull our capacity for awe and wonder. By reinforcing a strict materialist paradigm, we risk blocking the exact transformative states that are required for your healing. As the transpersonal psychologist Stanislav Graf warns, doing this risks turning a spiritual emergency into a very real psychiatric emergency. So, if we can't use the old methods, how do we get through this? Let's look at navigating the underworld and explore some true holistic pathways. Healing in this space requires a radical turning toward the experience rather than running away from it. Step 1 is contemplative inquiry. This means using meditation not just to relax or zone out, but to develop a witness consciousness so you can observe your suffering without becoming entirely identified with it. Step 2 is cosmological reorientation. This involves utilizing mythology to see your personal, agonizing suffering as part of a much larger, ancient, universal pattern. Step 3 is philosophical reframing, which means leaning heavily on ancient wisdom. Step 4 is crucial, community connection. You need specific spiritual companionship, people who can offer profound presence without instantly pathologizing your state of mind. And finally, step 5 is creative expression, using art, movement, or poetry to create a bridge so you can process experiences that completely exceed the limits of ordinary spoken language. Let's dive a bit closer into that philosophical reframing, because history's ancient traditions provide us with some incredible conceptual tools to transform all this existential confusion into crystal clear clarity. In Buddhism, we have the concept of sunyata, or emptiness. It teaches us that the void we feel isn't just dark nihilism, it's actual insight into the constructed nature of reality. Taoism offers Wu Wei, the practice of non-forcing. This helps us finally release our exhausting, constant resistance to pain. Existentialism confronts us with radical freedom. It sounds intimidating, but it invites us to stop looking for predetermined values from society and start fiercely creating our own authentic meaning. And Stoicism provides the control dichotomy, teaching us to focus our precious energy solely on what can be transformed, which allows us to navigate immense adversity with unshakable equanimity. Now, when we apply that mythological framework we talked about, particularly Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, we can actually map this whole thing out chronologically. Now, obviously, the exact timeline varies for everyone, but the pattern is universally consistent. It always begins with a deeply painful separation from the familiar, comfortable world. This is then followed by a terrifying descent into the complete unknown. That is the true dark night. Then comes the confrontation with immense internal challenges and the total dissolution of your ego. But crucially, and this is the most important part, this ultimately leads to the return. You come back, not as the person you were, but with a vastly, massively expanded awareness. This depression isn't a permanent baseline. It is a necessary chronological descent specifically for the sake of your evolution. Which brings us perfectly to the end of the cycle, the transformative return, and why we must honor the seasons of our own development. We absolutely must embrace a cyclic rather than linear view of human development. We need to reframe this spiritual depression as a gestational period. Hear me when I say this. This state is not a failure. It is not an illness. It is a completely necessary little death of your former identity, making way for a profound rebirth. Think about it in nature. Just as seeds require absolute crushing darkness beneath the soil to finally germinate, certain advanced forms of consciousness development demand a total withdrawal from external light and activity. The waiting you are doing in the dark is not passive suffering. It is the incredibly active incubation of entirely new possibilities for your life. This cyclic nature points us to our ultimate destination, and it's captured just perfectly by Stanislav Grof when he notes, "The psyche has a remarkable capacity to heal, to transform even the most difficult experiences into opportunities for spiritual growth, transformation of consciousness, and psychological healing. What initially appears to you and to society as a total psychological breakdown eventually reveals itself as a monumental breakthrough. The suffocating darkness of spiritual depression actually contains within it the very seeds of profound illumination and a deep, abiding compassion for all of humanity. What you're feeling right now, it is simply the pain of the seed finally breaking open." So, this leaves us with a really critical challenge regarding your own suffering today. Are you resisting the descent? Are you fighting tooth and nail, trying to force your way back to a reality and an identity that you have clearly already outgrown? Or are you finally ready to trust the emergent intelligence of life itself? The spiritual teacher Adyashanti notes that true surrender is actually the most radical thing we can possibly do. It's allowing life to be exactly as it is without any resistance. And I want to be clear, this isn't just passive resignation. It's exactly what the theologian Paul Tillich called the courage to be. It is facing the abyss head-on with radical, unshakable acceptance. I want to leave you with this truly breathtaking piece of advice from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Live the questions now." Please, do not demand immediate answers from the universe right now because honestly, you would not yet be able to live them. Your consciousness is actively evolving. The ground beneath you has vanished, not because you are falling, but because you are learning exactly how to fly. Have the courage to live the questions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I truly wish you profound peace on your journey inward.